He freed two alien sisters. They fought beside him when 12 raiders attacked his outpost. The settlement smelled of old oil, burned metal, and bodies that hadn't bathed in weeks. Rust creaked from towers that once carried banners of the Confederacy, now just skeleton poles rattling in the wind. The place was a halfway station at the edge of the frontier, half trade post, half slum, and half graveyard for the desperate. Rowan Vey stepped down from his battered crawler slowly, his right leg stiff with pain that never left. The war had taken much from him, brothers in arms, the future he once dreamed of, and even the easy rhythm of his stride. The limp was a reminder carved into his bones, the kind that no surgeon or medic could patch. His coat was worn, patched at the elbows, long enough to drag dust from the ground. The brim of his hat hid eyes dulled by years of silence. But if anyone looked close enough, they would see the cold fire still burning there. The look of a man who had killed and could do it again if pressed. He had come for supplies. That was all. Dried grain, fuel cells for the crawler, maybe coffee if the credits stretched. Nothing more. He had no taste for company, no craving for the noisy warmth of settlement taverns. But the station was not quiet. As Rowan walked across the grit-choked street, he noticed the way men gathered near the market square. Not in the loud camaraderie of gamblers or drunkards, but in a circle, tight, shoulders pressed, eyes gleaming with ugly hunger. That waiting silence, the kind he had heard before a battlefield charge. Rowan slowed his pace, a prickle running through the scar tissue on his ribs. His instincts whispered, trouble. He should have turned away. He should have pushed into the trade depot, bartered quickly, and left before anyone noticed the scarred soldier limping through. He told himself that twice, 3 times. But his feet didn't obey. Something in the air pulled him closer. When he edged near, he saw why. 2 women. No, not women exactly. Aliens, but humanoid enough for his gut to twist with anger at the sight. They stood shackled against the plasteel wall of the post office, wrists bound high by a single chain hooked to a steel ring. Their clothing was torn, stained with travel dirt and older cruelties. The taller one, with long hair the color of burnished copper and eyes green as polished jade, kept her chin high despite her gaunt frame. Her shoulders were angular, her lips cut and raw, but her gaze burned with the defiance of someone who would rather die than bow. Beside her stood a smaller figure, dark-haired, head lowered, trembling every few seconds as if some unseen lash still struck her from memory. Her skin was lighter than her sister's, her body frail from hunger, her silence loud with fear. Rowan felt his jaw tighten, his chest squeezed against the scar by his ribs, the one that always flared when ghosts came calling. The clerk at the counter smirked as Rowan approached. "You're late, soldier. Thought you'd missed the auction." Rowan said nothing. His gaze swept from the clerk to the chain, then back to the women. The smaller one dared to lift her eyes for a heartbeat, and in them he saw something raw. Not just fear, emptiness, the kind left when someone had been stripped down until even hope felt dangerous. "What's the iron cost?" Rowan asked finally, his voice low, steady. The clerk barked a laugh, and a few of the onlookers joined. "Chain don't sell separate. You take what's on it, both or none." Another man spat onto the floor, chuckling as if the whole thing were a fine joke. Rowan didn't move. He let the laughter die down. Slowly, with the patience of a man who'd faced worse crowds, he slid his hand into his coat. His fingers brushed the scar on his ribs before pulling out a small roll of credit notes, nearly all he had left from his last haul of salvaged ore. He peeled them off one by one, laying them on the counter, enough to choke the clerk's smile. "Write it up," Rowan said. "Clean." The grin faded. The clerk hesitated, then scribbled on a slip of paper. Rowan folded it once, tucked it into his coat, and turned to the chain. The key hung on a nail beside the heating vent. He plucked it free, ignoring the murmurs around him, and fitted into the cuffs. The first lock clicked, falling away from the taller woman's wrist. The second released the smaller one, leaving angry red grooves circling both arms. Rowan's breath caught when the tall one straightened, rubbing her skin but never looking away from him. Her eyes searched his face, hunting for the hidden price she was sure he would demand. Up close, she smelled of dust and long roads, of suffering endured too long. The smaller one's eyes were wide, wet but without tears, clutching at the torn remains of her dress, like it was the last thing keeping her whole. Rowan cleared his throat. There's a crawler outside, blankets, water, bread. Come. The taller one tilted her head slightly, her chin lifting. Your name? Her voice was hoarse but steady, with iron beneath the rasp. Rowan Vey, he answered. She gave a short nod. Theris. The other whispered softly, barely audible. Naira. Rowan inclined his head, then gestured to the door. No man moved to block their path. Still, Rowan felt their stares follow him, burning, mocking, hungry. He knew those looks. They wouldn't forget this. He guided the sisters through the crowd, across the dust-choked street, and to his crawler. It was an ugly beast of a machine, plated with scrap, patched with welds, the engine coughing like an old smoker. But it ran, and it carried him across the flats where law and gossip couldn't follow. Theris climbed aboard without help, her defiance still burning. Nira hesitated, glancing back at the crowd, as if expecting claws to snatch her back. Rowan's steady hand reached out, not grabbing, just waiting. After a breath, she placed her trembling fingers in his and let him help her up. The crawler rumbled to life, its engines drowning the whispers of the station as Rowan guided it down the track. Dust curled behind them, swallowing the outpost until it vanished into the horizon. Rowan kept his eyes on the barren plains stretching ahead. His hands were firm on the controls, but inside his head, voices clashed. You've bought trouble you don't need. You should have walked away. Let someone else carry this weight. But he knew better. He knew the look in their eyes, the hollow mix of fight and fear. If he had turned away, that emptiness would have followed him, gnawed at him. And so he drove on, the plains rolling bare and endless beneath the alien sky. The crawler carried them toward his lonely outpost, a place that hadn't heard another voice in years. Beside him sat silence, fragile, tense, and heavy with questions none of them were ready to ask. Rowan told himself it was just until spring, just until they healed enough to choose their path. But deep down in the place he rarely let himself feel, he knew better. The moment he unlocked that chain, his life had changed forever. The crawler groaned as it rolled over the frozen ridges of the plain. A thin veil of mist clung low to the ground, stirred up by every rumbling wheel. The silence inside the cab was heavier than the storm winds outside. Rowan drove steady, his hands on the rusted levers, but his ears were tuned to the weight behind him. The sisters sat in the rear seat, one upright, watchful, her posture stiff with suspicion. The other curled in the blanket he had thrown across her shoulders, quiet as breath. Neither spoke. He didn't expect them to. For a mile, the only sound was the rasp of the engine and the clank of suspension over rocks. Rowan kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, where jagged black hills clawed at the alien sky. His leg ached from the constant vibrations, the old wound stirring fire through bone. He ignored it. Finally, Saris's voice cut through the silence, sharp and steady. What happens now, human? You keep us for yourself? Or do you sell us again once you've had your fill of being generous? Rowan didn't turn. His jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. I'm not that kind of man. Her laugh was low and bitter, nothing like humor. Every man says that when he wants something later. He shifted the crawler around the ditch, the engine groaning as it climbed. Come spring, he said, you're free to go, both of you. No chains, no paper, no debt. Until then, there's food, a roof, and work to keep hands busy. That's all. The words hung heavy. Saris didn't answer right away. Out of the corner of his eye, Rowan saw her studying him, measuring whether the soldier's words carried truth or just another lie dressed in silence? Nira peeked at him once from under her blanket, wide dark eyes glinting in the dim light, before lowering her gaze again. The crawler climbed a final rise and rolled into the shallow valley where his outpost stood. Rowan's home wasn't much, low walls of stone and salvaged alloy sheets, a barn that leaned under years of storms, fences silvered from the wind, and a long porch facing the endless flats. Smoke curled weakly from the chimney, trailing into the pale sky. To Rowan, it was a fortress. To anyone else, it was a ruin barely clinging to life. When he stopped the crawler in the yard, he climbed down first, his legs stiffening until his boot hit the dirt. The women stayed in their seats, eyes sweeping the place like prisoners measuring another cage. "It ain't fancy," Rowan said, looping the crawler's reins over a post, "but it's dry and the stove draws well." He offered his hand. Saris looked at it, then at him, and climbed down on her own, chin raised. Her boots struck the ground with defiance. Nira hesitated, then followed, still clutching the blanket, her bare feet silent on the frozen soil. Inside, the outpost smelled of wood smoke, metal oil, and old soap. The floorboards creaked under Rowan's weight as he led them down the narrow hall. He opened a door to a small room, plain walls, a narrow bed, folded quilts stacked neatly. "You can take this one," he said, nodding to Saris. Then he turned to Nira. "Other rooms across the hall, water in the basin, fresh towels on the shelf." Neither woman spoke. They stood there like animals, still half wild, eyes darting, hearts pounding with mistrust. Rowan could feel it in the air. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "No one lays a hand on you without your say." "Not now, not ever." Saris's stare was sharp as glass, cutting through his words, searching for cracks. Nira glanced at him, then away, uncertain. After a long moment, Saris gave the faintest nod. Not trust, not yet, but something less than refusal. Rowan left them there and went to the kitchen. His hands trembled more than he liked as he set coffee to boil, the smell filling the quiet house. For the first time in years, the walls carried more than his own breath. Morning came gray and brittle. Frost clung to the fence posts, glittering like tiny shards of glass. Rowan rose before the sun, pulling on boots patched from years of wear, shrugging into the duster coat that carried the scent of horse and smoke. He half expected the women to be gone. It would have been easy. Slip away in the night, follow the crawler ruts back toward the settlement, anywhere but here. The thought twisted in his gut more than he wanted to admit. But when he stepped into the hallway, one door was shut, the other cracked just enough to show a quilt inside. They were still here. He let out a slow breath, the tension in his chest easing slightly. In the kitchen, he stoked the fire, set beans to warm, sliced a loaf of coarse bread. The smell filled the air by the time soft footsteps approached. Nira appeared first, wrapped in the blanket like armor. Her dark hair hung loose, tangled but clean. She hovered near the stove, avoiding his eyes, her hands pressed tight to the blanket's edge. "There's bread," Rowan said, nodding toward the table, "and beans on the plate." His voice came out gentler than he meant. She nodded once, quick, and took a piece of bread like it might vanish if she hesitated. She ate standing up, small bites, her eyes never leaving the floor. Saris entered later, hair combed back tight, wearing one of the plain dresses from the spare chest. It fit wrong at the shoulders, but it was whole. She moved with the same straight-back defiance as yesterday, her eyes sweeping the kitchen, marking corners, exits, escape routes. "You got rules here?" she asked, her voice clipped. "Only one," Rowan answered. "You do as you choose under this roof. Nobody forces you into anything." She studied him a long moment, weighing the words, then sat down. Tearing the bread clean in half, she ate in silence. When the meal was done, Rowan cleared his throat. "Stock needs feeding, fences need fixing, wood piles low. You don't have to help, but if you want something to keep your hands busy, there's plenty." Saris stood. "Show me the woodpile." Nira glanced at the door, then back to the fire. She didn't speak, but she gave the smallest nod. Outside, the wind cut sharp across the yard. The barn leaned against the weather, and beyond it the corral stretched wide. Rowan led them past the trough, boots grinding against frozen soil. "You'll need boots," he said, glancing at Nira's bare feet. "And coats. There are some things in the loft, old, but warm enough." At the woodpile, Rowan handed Saris a short-handled axe. She wrapped her fingers around the hickory grip like she'd done it before. Her first swing came down clean, splitting the log with a sharp crack. She stacked the halves without a word. Nira crouched beside the smaller pieces, gathering chips for kindling, her hair blowing across her cheeks. Her hands trembled against the cold, but she worked carefully, setting the chips into neat piles. Rowan shrugged out of his coat and draped it across her shoulders. She froze, eyes flicking up quickly. "Keep it till you're warm," he said. Her mouth opened as if to speak, then shut again. She nodded instead, clutching the coat close. By noon, the yard smelled of cut wood and frost. Saris's arms glistened with sweat where her sleeves had been rolled, the flush in her face making her look less hollow. The rhythm of work had loosened something in her jaw. Rowan watched as Nira smoothed his coat before hanging it carefully by the door, as though it were borrowed, not given. Saris brushed sawdust from her skirt and met his eyes without the hard edge she'd worn before. Questions still hung heavy. Why had he paid for them? What did he expect when the snow came deep and the nights grew long? Rowan didn't have the answer himself. All he knew was that, for the first time in years, the sound of other footsteps filled his home, breaking the silence that had haunted him. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something. Something that might, with time, grow roots. The sky hung low and pewter-colored, a flat weight pressing down on the plains. Wind clawed at the fences, rattling loose boards, and carrying with it the scent of snow that had not yet fallen. Rowan was in the corral, hammering a split rail back into place, when he heard the sound. It started faint, just a tremor in the ground, the steady rhythm of hooves striking frozen soil. His shoulders stiffened. He straightened slowly, leaning against the fence post, the limp pulling at his leg. He wasn't the only one who heard it. At the water pump, Saris froze mid-motion, bucket hanging from her arms. Her braids swung in the wind, her sharp green eyes narrowing at the horizon. Near the barn, Nira stiffened with a bundle of kindling in her arms, the color draining from her face. She pressed herself against the wall, as though trying to blend into it. Rowan didn't need to ask. They all knew what that sound meant. The riders came into view moments later, two men pushing tired but lathered beasts hard up the southern track. Their silhouettes sharpened as they neared the yard. Both carried themselves with that loose, dangerous swagger Rowan had seen too often during the war. Men who thought rules were for others. The lead rider was broad-shouldered, a jagged scar carving down past his left eye. The other was younger, leaner, with a grin that made Rowan's gut go tight. The scarred one swung down from his saddle, boots hitting dirt with a wet thud. Dust clouded around him as he tugged at his coat. "Morning, Boone," he called, his voice rough from whiskey and spite. Rowan didn't move from his place at the fence. His voice was flat, calm, the same tone he had used on battlefields when death walked close. "Can't say I was expecting company." The scarred man smirked. "Wouldn't call it company. Call it business." He spat to the side, boots crunching frost. "Heard you took something out of town that didn't belong to you." Behind Rowan, Saris's jaw tightened. Nira pressed harder against the barn wall, clutching the kindling so tight her knuckles blanched. Rowan didn't turn to them. He kept his gaze locked on the intruders. "Paid for what I took," he said. "Got paper in my coat to prove it." The scarred man's grin thinned. "Paper don't change what's owed." Rowan's eyes narrowed. Owed to who? He already knew the answer. Men like this didn't want the women for worker wages. They wanted them for what couldn't be written on any ledger. The younger raider leaned forward in his saddle, eyes flicking to Saris. "Pretty thing for a woodcutter. Shame to waste her on chores." His grin widened. Rowan's blood went hot, but his voice stayed even. Your piece is said. Now turn your horses and ride out. The scarred one chuckled low, stepping closer. You think we rode all this way to Jaw? Boone, you're alone out here. No law for miles. 2 women under your roof. Men are bound to talk. They can talk till their teeth rot, Rowan answered, his voice like stone. Won't change what happens if you try that door. He didn't move for the rifle leaning against the corral. He didn't have to. Men like these recognized when a line had been drawn too deep to step across without bleeding. For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind carried the smell of horse sweat and iron from their bits. Then Saris's voice cut the silence, sharp as a blade. You boys must be hard up for company if you rode this far for 2 women who don't want you. The younger one blinked, his grin faltering. The scarred man's eyes narrowed. Careful, sweetheart, he said. Talk like that, don't make friends. Don't need friends, Sarah shot back. Her chin lifted, and Rowan saw it, the fire burning under her ribs. She wasn't looking for rescue. She was demanding to be counted. Rowan stepped forward, his shadow falling long across the mud. His voice carried steady, low. You heard her. Mount up. The scarred raider studied him for a long beat, jaw flexing. Then he spat into the dirt, jerking his chin at the younger one. Ain't over, he muttered. They swung back into their saddles, wheeled their horses, and rode off the way they came, dust hanging in the air long after their figures vanished. Rowan didn't turn until the last sound of hooves faded into silence. Sarah still stood at the pump, shoulders squared, hands trembling against the bucket handle. Naira clung to the barn wall, eyes wide, her breath quick and shallow. Rowan crossed the yard slowly, stopping a few feet from them. They'll talk, Sarah said, voice tight. Let 'em, Rowan answered. Ain't their roof, ain't their say. He looked at Naira, then back at Saris. His voice hardened. You're safe here. Long as I've got breath, that won't change. Sarah searched his face for cracks, but whatever she found must have been solid enough. She gave a short nod, letting the handle drop. Naira stepped forward, just a fraction, but enough that Rowan saw the fear ease slightly from her eyes. That night, the lamps burned low inside the outpost. Shadows swung long against the walls as Rowan set a pot of beans to simmer. He kept his movements steady, hands sure even though his ribs burned with tension. At the table, Sarah sat with her sleeves rolled, her jaw set hard. She cleaned the blade of a borrowed knife, the motions sharp. Naira curled near the stove, mending one of the old dresses from the trunk. Her hands shook occasionally, but the needle moved steady. Any trouble while I was out? Rowan asked, voice quiet. Sarah shook her head. Just quiet, but they'll be back. Maybe, Rowan said. Maybe not them, but someone will. Word moves fast when men think they've been cheated. Nero's voice was soft, fragile as thread. What happens then? Rowan met her eyes. Same thing that happened today. They ride in, they ride out. They don't lay a hand on either of you. The silence that followed was thick, filled with unspoken questions. How long this arrangement would last, what it would cost, and what each of them was willing to give when things grew worse. He stirred the beans, ladled portions into bowls, and set them on the table. Not much meat left. I'll make a run for supplies before the next snow. Saris frowned. You go back to town alone? After today? I'll go armed, Rowan said. Ain't the first time I've had to watch my back. Her gaze lingered on him, measuring the quiet confidence, testing whether it would hold when the storm came. They ate in silence, but it wasn't the same silence as before. Something had shifted. A small piece of truth had been laid bare, and in that ground, trust could take root, if they let it. Later, when the dishes were cleaned and the lamps burned low, Rowan stepped outside for air. The stars were sharp against the black sky, the cold biting through his coat. He thought of the riders, of the paper in his coat, of the 2 women sleeping under his roof. He told himself it was temporary, just until spring, just until they could stand on their own. But deep down, he knew better. The choice he made at that counter in Copper Bend wasn't something a man could walk away from. And tonight proved it. When the raiders came, it wasn't just him who stood against them. Saris had thrown her voice like a blade. Nira hadn't run. The weight in his chest wasn't just fear. It was something else. Something dangerous. The beginnings of belonging. The wind came down from the northern ridges like knives, whistling through the cracks of the old barn. Snow gathered in shallow drifts against the posts, glittering under a pale moon. Rowan swung the last door shut, bolting it tight, before limping back across the yard. His leg burned from the cold, but he kept his stride steady. Inside the house, warmth breathed from the stove, filling the rooms with a soft glow. Shadows stretched across the walls, dancing in the lamplight. For the first time in years, the outpost didn't feel hollow. Sarah sat at the table, her sleeves rolled, braids slipping loose across her shoulder. She looked calm, but her jaw held the hard line of someone still fighting battles in her head. Across the room, Nira curled close to the stove, a quilt wrapped around her shoulders, needle in hand as she mended one of the old coats. Her hair fell in dark waves, catching glints of firelight. Rowan hung his coat on the peg, rubbing stiffness from his leg. He had expected to come into silence, but instead, the room carried the steady rhythm of small domestic sounds, thread pulling through fabric, wood crackling, the scrape of Saris's knife on the table. It felt different, alive. He crossed to the counter, poured steaming coffee into tin mugs, and set one near each of them. Nira lifted her eyes briefly, a flicker of gratitude passing across her face before she bent back to her work. Saris studied him a moment longer, like she was mapping every move, then took the mug in a strong hand. No words were spoken. None were needed. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. At dawn, Rowan rose to feed the stock, check the fences, and haul water from the pump. Saris was usually first to join him, her strength making her a natural hand at chores. She swung the axe with the precision of someone who had learned long before captivity, stacking logs until sweat glistened at her temples, despite the cold. Rowan found himself watching her more than once, the way her jaw eased when the rhythm of work carried her anger away. Nira stayed closer to the house. She gathered kindling, patched torn clothes, and cooked when Rowan's hands were too stiff from the cold. She still trembled sometimes, especially at sudden noises, but she spoke more often now. Small words, simple questions, enough to reveal a quiet, thoughtful mind beneath the fear. Rowan gave them space. He had never been good with soft words, but he knew enough to let silence do the talking. And slowly, bit by bit, the silence changed. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was company. One night the wind howled like voices outside. Snow hissed against the shutters, rattling them on their old hinges. Rowan sat in the kitchen, a ledger open before him, though he hadn't read a word. His ribs ached with the deep, dull pain that always came when storms pressed in. A sound pulled him from his thoughts, the faint pad of bare feet. Nira stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket. Her hair spilled loose down her back, her eyes wide in the lamplight. "Can't sleep?" Rowan asked, his voice low. She shook her head, clutching the blanket tighter. "Wind sounds like voices." He nodded. "Gets inside your head if you let it. Fire's still good. Sit a spell." She crossed the floor, sat across from him, hands curling around the edge of the blanket. For a while, neither spoke. The storm filled the silence between them. Rowan poured the last of the coffee into a cup and slid it across. Nira wrapped her fingers around it, as though the heat mattered more than the taste. "You ain't cold?" he asked quietly. Her lips trembled against the rim. "Always cold now," she whispered, "even when I'm warm." Rowan knew that kind of cold, the kind that settled in your bones when fear was the only blanket you'd known too long. "I can work in the barn," she said suddenly, her voice thin but determined, "or mend fences. I don't want to just sit and take from you." "You don't owe me anything," Rowan said. She met his gaze then, and something in the way her dark eyes steadied on his cut deeper than he expected. "I want to feel like I belong somewhere." The words sat heavy in his chest. He stood, fed another stick of wood into the stove, just for something to do with his hands. When he turned back, she was still watching him. "You've done enough for one day," he said softly. She rose, setting the cup down. For a moment he thought she'd leave, but instead she stopped in front of him. Her blanket slipped down to her elbows, leaving her arms bare in the firelight. "Thank you," she whispered. Then she leaned up and pressed her lips to his cheek. Light as breath, fleeting as a ghost. By the time he exhaled, she was gone down the hall, door clicking shut. Rowan stood staring at the cup still warm from her hands, his pulse hammering like he'd just faced a firing line. The next day, Saris came with him to mend the north fence. The ground was frozen hard, the posts leaning after years of wind. Rowan carried the post maul, Saris a coil of wire slung over her shoulder. She worked beside him without complaint, her strong hands steady as she set rails back in place. Once, when the wire slipped, their hands closed over the same stretch of steel. Her fingers were calloused, cold, but she didn't pull away. Their eyes met, and for once there was no suspicion in hers, only heat banked low, steady as coals. "You think those men will come back?" she asked finally, twisting wire taut. "Maybe," Rowan said. "And if they bring more than words next time?" He met her stare full on. "They'll have to go through me." Something shifted in her jaw, then softened. She dropped the wire and stepped closer, her hand rising to his face. A callous thumb brushed the scar along his jaw. Her kiss wasn't soft. It was fierce, tasting of iron and wind, and all the words unsaid since he unshackled her wrists. His hand found the back of her neck, holding her there like something he hadn't known he was starving for. When they broke apart, both were breathing rough. Saris stepped back first, eyes sharp but shining. "That answer your question?" she asked. Rowan almost smiled despite himself. "Wasn't sure I'd asked one." "Maybe you didn't have to," she said, turning to gather the tools. They walked back without speaking, but the air between them was no longer empty. It was charged, alive, full of something neither of them had the courage to name. That evening the air was sharp, the sky orange with the sinking sun. Inside, the house smelled of bread baking. Rowan sat at the table sharpening his knife, slow strokes steady in the quiet. Nira moved between stove and counter, her braids swinging, her face gentler than he'd seen yet. Saris entered last, the scent of cold air clinging to her, strands of hair loose around her cheeks. Her eyes met Rowan's, and without words, he knew she hadn't come back from the fence unchanged. They ate together in near silence, spoons scraping bowls, fire snapping in the stove. Darkness pressed against the windows, thick and alive. After supper, Rowan poured coffee, set a cup by each of them, and sat with them in a small circle of lamplight. Nira's voice broke the quiet. "If those men come back, what happens to us if you can't stop them?" Rowan met her gaze steady. "Then they'll have to kill me first, and I don't plan on making that easy." Saris's eyes flickered, sharp as iron. "That's not what she asked." "I reckon you'd fight too," Rowan said. The silence that followed wasn't fear anymore. It was reckoning. The wind rose again the next day, carrying dust and snow across the flats. By noon, another cloud formed on the southern horizon. Horses, more than two this time. Rowan stood at the porch, rifle cradled loose but ready, watching as 5 riders broke over the rise. Their leader was the scarred man, his grin uglier than before. "Boone," he shouted as they closed in, stopping 10 feet from the porch. "Told you this wasn't finished." Rowan's voice was steady as stone. "Looks finished from here." The scarred man spat. "Not till we take what's ours." His eyes cut to the doorway, where Saris and Nira stood framed in shadow. "They belong where they choose," Rowan answered. "And they've chosen. Turn your horses. Ride out." The scarred one laughed, rough and humorless. "Or what? You'll shoot 5 men before we put you in the dirt? Rowan's grip didn't shake. I'll shoot the first one who moves, and after that, maybe I go down. But you, his voice sharpened, his gaze locked like steel. You won't live to see it. The yard held still, every breath suspended. Then Sarah stepped out, holding Rowan's old Colt steady in her hands. You forgot something, she said, voice like drawn wire. There's 3 of us now. The scarred man's grin faltered. His eyes cut to Nira, who lifted the shotgun from the wall, hands firm, eyes no longer trembling. The silence stretched, thick enough to choke. Then the raider spat again, yanked his reins, and wheeled his horse. Ain't worth the blood, he muttered. One by one, the riders pulled back, kicking dust as they vanished over the flats. Rowan didn't lower his rifle until the last shadow was gone. When he turned, Sarah still stood tall with the Colt, eyes hard but shining. Nira set the shotgun down slowly, her fingers trembling, but her chin high. Rowan looked at both of them. The weight in his chest shifted. This wasn't him protecting them anymore. This was the 3 of them standing together. And for the first time in years, Rowan knew, whatever storm was coming, he wasn't facing it alone. Snow fell thick and heavy, muffling the world in white silence. By morning, the fences were half buried, the barn door rimmed with frost, and the sky hung low like a ceiling of ash. Rowan stoked the stove until the iron glowed red, his breath steaming as he pulled on his coat. Something in the silence unsettled him. He stepped onto the porch, rifle cradled against his arm. The snow stretched endless across the flats, but in the distance, a smear of black moved against the white. Horses. Not 2, not 5, at least a dozen. Rowan's jaw locked. He limped back inside, shutting the door behind him. They're coming, he said. Steris looked up from the table where she was oiling the Colt. Nira froze near the stove, a basket of kindling slipping from her hands. How many? Steris asked, voice flat. Too many. Rowan set the rifle on the table, began checking rounds with a calmness that came only from long years of war. This time, they aimed to finish it. The room stilled. The storm outside pressed against the walls. Nira swallowed hard. Then we'll fight. Rowan looked at her, really looked, and for the first time saw no tremble in her voice, only resolve. Damn right we will, Sarah said. This is our home now. Rowan's chest tightened. He had expected fear, hesitation, maybe pleased to run. Instead, both sisters met the storm with fire in their eyes. For a man who had long since given up on belonging, the weight of that loyalty nearly broke him. All right, he said, then we make our stand. They worked fast. Rowan barred the windows with planks, stacking sacks of grain against the walls for cover. Steris hauled crates into position, her movements sharp and steady. Nira checked the shotgun, her slim hands sliding shells into the chamber with care. When the first riders appeared on the horizon, the house no longer looked like a homestead. It looked like a fortress. Snow muffled the sound of hooves until the raiders thundered close, circling the yard. A dozen men, rifles glinting, their leader at the front, scarred face twisted in fury. Boone, he roared. His voice carried across the snow, sharp as a blade. You got one chance. Hand him over, or we burn this place down with you in it. Rowan leaned out the porch door, rifle braced. His voice was steady. Come and try. The scarred man grinned. Then blood it is. He raised his hand. The first shot cracked the silence. Rowan's rifle barked, the round dropping one of the raiders clean from his saddle. Chaos erupted. Gunfire tore through the still air, wood splintering, snow exploding in plumes where bullets struck. Theris crouched by the window, Colt bucking in her hands. Her shots were measured, precise, every squeeze of the trigger sending another raider reeling. She moved like someone born to battle, her eyes sharp with fury unleashed. Nira stayed near the stove at first, shotgun trembling in her grip. But when one rider broke toward the porch, she stepped forward, bracing the weapon against her shoulder. The blast echoed like thunder, and the raider tumbled back into the snow, his horse screaming. Rowan glanced at her, saw the shock in her face, but also the resolve. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. "Good shot," he barked, reloading his rifle. "Keep your head down." The fight raged. Snow turned red, men shouting, horses shrieking as bullets cut the air. The raiders pressed hard, firing from behind saddles and posts, but Rowan's aim was unyielding, every shot dropping another enemy. Still, they were many, too many. The scarred man himself charged the porch, pistol blazing. Rowan met him head-on, firing once before the hammer clicked empty. The raider slammed into him, driving them both through the doorway in a crash of wood and snow. Rowan hit the floor hard, pain flaring through his ribs. The pistol's barrel pressed against his chest. "End of the line, old soldier," the scarred man spat. Before he could fire, Saris was there. She crashed into the raider's side, the Colt smashing across his jaw. He roared, slamming her back into the wall, pistol turning toward her, and Nira's shotgun roared again. The blast caught the raider full in the shoulder, spinning him across the floor. His pistol clattered from numb fingers, blood soaking the boards. Rowan dragged himself up, breath ragged. He snatched the fallen gun, pressed it to the raider's throat. The man coughed blood, snarling through broken teeth. "You think this ends it? More will come. They always do." Rowan's finger tightened. His voice was low, cold. "Then they'll find nothing left but bones." He fired once. The raider went still. The silence after the fight was heavy, broken only by the hiss of wind against the walls. The yard was littered with bodies, dark shapes against the snow. The surviving horses bolted into the flats, their riders never to rise again. Inside, Rowan stood shaking, the rifle still smoking in his hands. Blood soaked his sleeve where a bullet had grazed him, pain burning deep. Saris leaned against the wall, her breath harsh, face pale but eyes fierce. Her hands were steady despite the blood spattered across them. Nira sank to her knees, the shotgun slipping from her fingers. Her chest heaved, eyes wide as she stared at what she had done. For a moment, she looked like she might shatter. Rowan limped to her side, kneeling despite the fire in his leg. He set a hand on her shoulder, firm and grounding. "You saved us," he said. Her eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but release. For the first time, she believed she wasn't helpless. Saris crossed the floor, crouching beside them. She took Nira's trembling hand in hers, squeezing hard. "You're stronger than you know," she said softly. The three of them stayed like that, wounded, bloodied, but alive, a small circle against the storm. By nightfall, the snow covered the bodies outside, burying them under white silence. The fire burned bright in the stove, casting the room in warm gold. Rowan sat at the table, bandaged arm resting on the wood, while Saris poured steaming broth into bowls. Nira sat close, her hand brushing his every time she passed the bread. They ate in quiet, but it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of belonging. When the bowls were empty, Saris set hers aside, standing tall despite exhaustion. "You saved us," she said, eyes locked on Rowan. Rowan shook his head. "We saved each other." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. She stepped closer, resting a calloused hand on his cheek. "Then we're yours, both of us. Not by paper, not by chain, by choice." Nira's soft voice joined hers. "We stay, if you'll have us." Rowan's chest tightened. For years he had been nothing but a ghost, living among ruins. Now 2 women stood before him, strong, fierce, alive, and offered him the one thing he thought he had buried forever. "Home." He swallowed hard, nodding once. "Then we'll make a life here, together." Saris leaned in, her lips fierce against his. Nira's hands slid into his, warm and trembling, but sure. The storm outside raged on, but within the walls of the outpost something stronger burned, fire enough to outlast the cold. Rowan Vey, the outcast warrior, had finally found more than survival. He had found a family. The end.